the heart of an affluent, tightly knit community where security gates guarded the pristine homes and polished golf carts rolled silently across lush greens, the idea of real danger seemed like a distant thought. People lived under the comforting illusion that their wealth and status protected them from the kind of violence seen on the evening news. The country club wasn't just a place to play golf or attend charity galas. It was a symbol of safety, order, and belonging. So when a young woman was found murdered near the club's edge, her body lying still beneath the shadow of perfection, the entire illusion shattered like a cracked mirror. The whispers that followed weren't just about the tragedy itself, but about the unsettling idea that something so dark could happen in a place so polished. This wasn't a random act of violence in a distant city alley. It happened in a place where children played freely, where champagne flowed at weekend brunches, and where reputations were everything. The murder felt like an invasion, not just of physical space, but of the community's belief that money and social standing made them immune to tragedy. They believed that bad things happened elsewhere, to other people, not to them, but now they were forced to question everything. The victim wasn't just anyone. She was a familiar face, seen often at events and social gatherings, always dressed to impress, always part of the backdrop of country club life. Her presence had been part of the environment. Her sudden absence was deafening. And the fact that she was taken in such a violent way was a blow to the very foundation of what the community stood for. The news spread like wildfire, each telling of the story laced with fear, suspicion, and disbelief. For many, it was the first time they locked their doors at night. For others, it was the first time they realized they truly didn't know their neighbors. The police began their investigation immediately, but they were met with a wall. Polished smiles, carefully worded statements, and a community unwilling to expose its secrets. People who once mingled freely became tight-lipped and guarded. Friendships grew cold. The murder had done more than take a life. It had broken the fragile trust that held the community together. And the longer the investigation went on, the more it became clear that this wasn't a crime committed by an outsider. The killer was someone within. The illusion of security had lulled the residents into complacency. But now, every glance, every interaction was filled with doubt. The cameras at the front gate suddenly weren't enough. The golf course didn't feel so peaceful. The country club, with its white columns and sparkling chandeliers, took on a sinister air. The line between friend and suspect blurred. And as detectives peeled back the layers of the community's perfectly curated image, they found things far more dangerous than they expected. Jealousy, resentment, infidelity, and desperation hidden beneath tailored suits and designer sunglasses. The murder wasn't just shocking because of how it happened. It was terrifying because of where it happened and who it happened to. It forced people to reckon with a hard truth, that evil doesn't need poverty, broken homes, or dark alleyways to thrive. Sometimes it flourishes in silence and comfort, in places where appearances matter more than honesty, and where people are too afraid to speak out against their own. As the town grappled with this harsh reality, the case became more than a crime story. It was a moment of collective awakening, and while the investigation moved forward, inch by inch, the psychological damage had already been done. The belief that money could shield them, that a gated community could insulate them, was gone forever. In its place was a lingering question: if it could happen here, to someone like her, what other darkness was being hidden behind those beautiful doors? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the glossy surface of country club life masked something far more twisted than anyone wanted to admit. The detectives, trained to look beyond polite smiles and staged perfection, began noticing subtle cracks in the carefully constructed image of the community. What started as whispers turned into rumors, and those rumors evolved into undeniable patterns of deceit. Beneath the social niceties and curated lifestyles were deeply buried secrets. Passionate affairs carried on behind closed doors, financial empires on the brink of collapse, and rivalries so bitter they made the notion of civility feel like a performance. The people at the center of the investigation weren't criminals in the conventional sense. They were socialites, business owners, and professionals. Individuals who dined together, vacationed together, and toasted glasses at gala events. Yet, beneath those elegant settings, simmered years of tension. A woman whose husband had been seen arguing with the victim suddenly became a figure of interest, not just because of what she said, but because of what she refused to say. Her carefully chosen words were more telling than any outburst. A businessman who had always seemed generous and confident now appeared evasive, his charm unable to mask the growing inconsistencies in his story. Detectives found themselves navigating a maze of manipulation. Everyone had something to lose, and the fear of public humiliation often outweighed the pursuit of truth. People were more concerned about their reputations than justice. Friends who once posed arm in arm for photographs were now lawyering up, each fearing the other knew too much. Social bonds eroded quickly when privacy was threatened. The same people who held each other's secrets now used those secrets as leverage. It was no longer about loyalty. It was about survival. One of the most shocking discoveries was the depth of financial despair hidden behind the facade of wealth. Bank records, private emails, and text messages revealed that several members of the country club were living beyond their means, desperate to maintain an image of prosperity. Mortgages were defaulting, investments had collapsed, and a few were drowning in gambling debts. Maintaining the illusion of success had become a full-time job, and that illusion came at a price. For some, that price may have included blood. Infidelity added another volatile element to the mix. The victim had been involved in a relationship that was anything but casual, and the fallout from that relationship spread like wildfire through the investigation. Jealousy reared its head in unexpected places. People who had been overlooked before were suddenly seen in a new light. An ex-boyfriend who claimed he had moved on, a woman scorned by her husband's affair, a quiet employee who had been watching from the sideline. The deeper the detectives dug, the more motives they uncovered, each more plausible than the last. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of it all was the community's determination to control the narrative. As suspicion spread, so did silence. Those who might have come forward with useful information were subtly pressured to stay quiet. It wasn't just about protecting individuals. It was about protecting the institution of the country club itself. Any scandal would tarnish the brand they had worked so hard to build. Public image took priority, even in the face of murder. And so detectives were left not just solving a crime, but breaking through a carefully maintained culture of denial. In this world, truth was a threat, not just because of what it revealed, but because of what it could destroy. The affairs, the financial ruin, the rivalries, they weren't just personal failures. They were interconnected parts of a larger, toxic web of appearances and ambition. Everyone was tied together by shared secrets, mutual blackmail, and the desperate need to remain untouchable. The victim may have been the first to fall, but as the investigation peeled back the layers, it became clear that many others were already standing at the edge. The murder had simply pulled back the curtain. The community, once viewed as the pinnacle of elegance and order, began to reveal a disturbing reality when investigators turned their focus inward. It became clear that even those held in the highest regard were not above suspicion. Respected members of society, people who had built careers on trust, status, and authority, were suddenly found entangled in lies. Their social standing could no longer shield them from scrutiny. Detectives started noticing how quickly the charm faded when questions became uncomfortable and when reputations were placed on the line. The polished facades of the elite began to crack under pressure, exposing the same flaws, fears, and motives as anyone else. The illusion that power and position equated to moral superiority collapsed. One man, known in the town as a generous donor and a leader on multiple boards, became a central figure in the investigation. He had always been seen as someone above reproach, calm, articulate, and deeply embedded in the social fabric of the country club. But when it was revealed that he had a long-standing connection to the victim, questions about his integrity surged. Suddenly, his business trips were reevaluated, his phone records combed through, and his friendships questioned. Investigators uncovered contradictions in his timeline and conversations that suggested something darker lurking beneath his controlled demeanor. The more he denied involvement, the more the community wondered what he was truly hiding. His wife, equally respected and admired, was no less a mystery. Graceful, reserved, and impeccably poised, she became known for her silence. But silence can often be more telling than words. Friends who had known her for decades began whispering about how distant she had become in recent months, how guarded and withdrawn. Private investigators found that she had quietly closed several bank accounts and had been spending nights away from home under vague pretenses. While there was no immediate evidence linking her to the crime, her proximity to the suspect and the victim raised unsettling questions. Her presence, once calming and sophisticated, now seemed cold and impenetrable. Other high-profile individuals, doctors, lawyers, club executives, found themselves under the microscope. Their positions had always given them a certain confidence, a belief that they were above consequence. But now, those very positions made their actions even more suspicious. Each of them had something to lose. Their spotless public images were now liabilities. Already with Brett alive, both killed met Hellman both. Investigators discovered that one had engaged in an affair with a close friend of the victim and had been sending threatening messages in the days leading up to her death. Another had been implicated in a past legal scandal that had been quietly settled out of court, buried so deeply that most people had forgotten. Until now, these people had built their lives on being respected, on being trusted pillars of their community, but with the murder, those identities unraveled. No one was untouchable anymore. Everyone had become a suspect, and it was clear that their reputations had more to do with perception than reality. The country club, once a symbol of social hierarchy and prestige, had transformed into a stage where the privileged performed civility while hiding their chaos backstage. The investigation forced a reckoning. The very people who had once been hailed as role models were now viewed through a lens of doubt. It wasn't just the crime that shocked the town. It was who might have committed it. Watching the fall of such figures, who had seemed so composed and controlled, was like watching a statue slowly crumble under its own weight. The realization that these individuals, those entrusted with leadership, community responsibility, and moral influence, could be capable of deceit, or worse, was more unsettling than the murder itself. Their downfall didn't come all at once. It came in subtle shifts. A shaky voice in an interview, an evasive glance during a public statement, a hidden email revealed at the right moment. It came in the form of broken trust, not just between them and the investigators, but between them and the very people who once admired them. Their names, once spoken with reverence, were now uttered with suspicion, and in a place where reputation was everything, that shift in perception was a collapse, more devastating than any courtroom verdict. The deeper investigators dug into the details of the murder, the more the forensic evidence began to strip away the polished stories being told by those closest to the victim. What had initially seemed like a clean, almost staged crime scene began to speak volumes under the scrutiny of scientific analysis. Tiny fragments, trace blood droplets, smudged fingerprints on crystal glass, hairs clinging to the upholstery of a luxury vehicle, began the threads that started to unravel the narrative. What couldn't be explained by words was revealed by the cold, impartial truths that only forensics could provide. One of the first major breakthroughs came from the victim's clothing. Fibers not belonging to her were found on the inside of her jacket. Fibers traced back to a high-end custom wool coat known to be owned by one of the country club's most recognizable men. He had told detectives that he hadn't seen her for weeks, claiming their relationship had been distant and strained, yet the forensic match contradicted his account. The Countess stammered. "I didn't understand him. Half had a cigarette." She claimed to be who knows what. The moment this discovery was made, his confident posture cracked. He wasn't just being asked questions anymore. He was being doubted by science. A shattered wine glass was found near the scene, tucked discreetly under a hedge behind the club's private terrace. At first, it seemed unrelated, but upon closer inspection, investigators found partial fingerprints on the base of the glass. These prints were compared against those of every person who had attended the event that evening. One match stood out. A woman who had claimed she never left the ballroom that night, who insisted she had nothing to do with the victim, was now directly linked to the very area where the murder occurred. Her explanation changed quickly, first to confusion, then to vague excuses about stepping outside for fresh air. The forensic trail, however, told a much more precise and damning story. Even more damning was the blood evidence found in the trunk of a luxury vehicle parked near the side entrance of the club, an area without security cameras. The blood was a small smear, nearly invisible to the naked eye, but luminol testing revealed a much larger presence had once been there. DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to the victim. The car belonged to another club member, who initially claimed it hadn't been driven that night, but tire impressions in the gravel, later matched with the vehicle's tread pattern, proved otherwise. Confronted with this evidence, he faltered, admitting he had given someone else the keys, but refused to say who. The security footage added another layer to the case. Though the club's main entrances were covered by high-resolution cameras, some areas, such as the maintenance corridor and private staff entrances, were less monitored. Still, one low-resolution camera facing a service gate caught a figure moving hurriedly through the shadows. Enhancing the footage revealed a person wearing clothing consistent with what one suspect had worn earlier in the evening. Though the image was too grainy for facial identification, the figure's distinctive gait and a visible accessory, a unique belt buckle later found in that suspect's home, connected them to the scene. Phone records became another weapon in the hands of investigators. Call logs and message histories were retrieved from multiple devices, and while many tried to delete or hide conversations, digital forensics often retrieved what's buried. Deleted messages between two individuals revealed tense arguments about the victim, financial disputes, and the implication of a threat made just days before her death. These weren't casual texts. They were emotionally charged, desperate, and laced with veiled language. Enough to show motive, timing, and connection. When confronted with the evidence, both individuals attempted to downplay the conversations, claiming misunderstandings, but the timestamps aligned perfectly with moments leading up to the crime. Throughout the process, science continued to fill in the blanks that lies had left open. Footprints in wet soil matched designer shoes only available to a handful of people in the area. A single strand of hair, found clenched in the victim's hand, carried enough DNA to point directly at someone who swore they hadn't touched her. Bit by bit, the forensic puzzle assembled itself. Not in dramatic revelations all at once, but in quiet, irrefutable pieces. What the suspects tried to bury beneath charm, wealth, and influence, the evidence calmly exposed. As investigators pressed further into the heart of the case, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that pushed the murder far beyond the bounds of a single tragic act. Initially, the victim's death appeared to be the result of a personal dispute, perhaps a love affair gone wrong, or a heated argument that spiraled into violence. But as the evidence began to converge, a broader, far more chilling narrative took shape. This was not an isolated event. The trail of information pointed back to another death that had occurred months earlier, previously dismissed as an accident, now impossible to ignore in the context of this new crime. The earlier case involved a young man who had been found at the base of a ravine during a late-night walk. At the time, his death was ruled an accidental fall, blamed on poor lighting and a slippery slope near the edge of a hiking trail. There were no witnesses, no security cameras, and only minor signs of a struggle. Things easy to overlook when no foul play was suspected. But now, with the recent murder sparking fresh scrutiny, detectives revisited that file. What they found were inconsistencies: bruising that didn't align with the fall pattern, broken fingernails suggestive of a fight, and a cell phone that had been mysteriously wiped clean just before the incident. More disturbing was the connection between the two victims. They both frequented the same country club, moved in the same social circles, and had personal ties to several of the same suspects now under investigation. Suddenly, detectives began asking a new question. Was this murder part of a series? Was someone carefully orchestrating deaths to look like unfortunate circumstances? The idea shifted the tone of the investigation. This wasn't a matter of solving one crime. It was now about identifying a methodical, calculating individual capable of manipulating events and eliminating those who stood in their way. As detectives dug deeper into this possibility, they started identifying other incidents previously brushed aside: minor accidents, overdoses, unexplained disappearances. Though none had raised red flags at the time, several bore similarities in proximity, timing, or personal connections to the growing pool of suspects. What had once seemed like separate tragedies now hinted at something orchestrated, perhaps even planned well in advance. These weren't crimes of passion. They were structured, intentional moves within a larger, unseen agenda. Interviews with club staff and members provided more pieces to the puzzle. One employee recalled overhearing a heated exchange between the second victim and a club member just days before his death. The employee hadn't reported it then, thinking it was a private matter. But now the conversation took on new meaning. The argument had been about money, and about something one of them couldn't be allowed to reveal. That single phrase, offhand and vague at the time, became a critical thread in understanding motive. Even more revealing was a pattern in the timing of the deaths. Both occurred just days before major events at the club, one before the annual financial audit and the other before the gala fundraiser. It suggested that someone was using the chaos of large gatherings to obscure their actions, taking advantage of distraction and movement to cover their tracks. It also pointed to a certain confidence, even arrogance, that the killer believed they could operate undetected in plain sight. This growing web of connections changed the entire tone of the case. Detectives stopped treating it as a single homicide and began constructing a profile of someone capable of maintaining control, manipulating those around them, and removing obstacles with clinical precision. Every new piece of evidence, every re-examined file brought them closer to understanding not just how the crimes were committed, but why. The motive wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. There was something to gain, something to protect, and those who got too close to the truth were being silenced. The cold realization settled over the team that they weren't dealing with a spontaneous outburst of violence. This was calculated, it was patterned. And most unsettling of all, it may not have been over. The possibility that more lives were at risk, simply for knowing too much, pushed the investigation into overdrive. Detectives weren't just racing to solve a murder anymore. They were working against the clock to stop a potential killer who had already proven they could hide in plain sight and strike again without warning. The courtroom was a theater of tension, where every glance, gesture, and word was loaded with meaning. The high ceilings and polished wood couldn't contain the electricity in the air as people from across the community filled the seats, eager to witness the unraveling of a mystery that had shaken their sense of reality. Reporters lined the back rows, pens scribbling across notepads, eyes fixed on the defendants. Families of both the victim and the accused sat silently, their faces tight with fear, sorrow, and anticipation. This wasn't just a trial, it was a public reckoning, and the entire town had come to see it unfold. The prosecution stepped forward with calm confidence, laying out their case piece by piece. They opened with forensic data: DNA matches, surveillance footage, digital footprints, all woven into a compelling narrative. Each item was like a puzzle piece, fitting together to form a portrait of guilt. The evidence wasn't just technical. It told a story. A fingerprint here, a text message there, a mysterious transaction, a deleted call log, all leading to a moment of truth the defense could no longer ignore. Prosecutors showed how the accused had motive, opportunity, and most damning of all, a trail of lies that began unraveling the moment the investigation began. But it was the testimonies that truly shocked the courtroom. One after another, witnesses stepped forward and revealed details that were both riveting and devastating. A former friend of the accused described tense conversations in hushed voices behind closed doors. An employee of the club admitted to overhearing arguments that had previously been dismissed. Even a member of the victim's family took the stand and described strange behaviors and threats made in the days leading up to the murder. The courtroom held its breath as each piece of the story added more weight to the prosecution's case. The defense tried to counter, of course. Their strategy relied heavily on character witnesses, insisting the accused was incapable of such brutality, that they were being misunderstood, framed, or caught in a tragic web of coincidences. They pointed to the lack of clear motive and tried to paint the investigation as flawed or biased. But with every passing day, their arguments seemed more like desperate attempts to cloud the truth. When they couldn't explain away the forensic evidence, they attacked its reliability. When they couldn't dismiss the witnesses, they tried to question their motives. Still, the jury was watching. And the jury was listening. The most powerful moment came when the prosecution revealed messages between the accused and an unknown number. These messages were encrypted and deleted, but digital forensics recovered fragments enough to show a disturbing narrative. There were discussions about silencing the victim, fears that a secret would come out, and talk of taking care of things before the situation got worse. Though not a confession, the implication was clear. The prosecution's lead attorney paused for effect, then looked directly at the jury and asked, "If this wasn't a conspiracy to commit murder, then what was it?" The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. The reaction outside the courtroom was just as intense. Media outlets ran headlines with each revelation, turning the trial into a national story. The once admired figures now accused of murder were now the subjects of late-night monologues and social media outrage. The town, once unified by its pride and privilege, was now deeply divided. Some in denial, others demanding justice with clenched fists and tearful eyes. The ripple effect reached every corner of the community, from the school board to city council meetings, where people questioned how long such deception had been allowed to thrive. Through it all, the accused remained mostly expressionless, sometimes whispering to their lawyers, sometimes staring blankly at the ceiling, as if disconnected from the moment. Their composed exterior only added to the unease, as though the weight of the situation hadn't fully registered. But each damning detail brought visible cracks. Tightened jaws, clenched hands, sudden glances toward the gallery when someone unexpected entered. As the final arguments closed, and the room prepared for the verdict, everyone could feel that something irreversible had happened. This wasn't just about determining guilt. It was about exposing a truth the entire town had tried to bury. And now, under the harsh lights of the courtroom, there was no more hiding. The verdict had been read, and the sound of the judge's gavel echoed like a final heartbeat through the courtroom. In that instant, a wave of emotions crashed across the room. Relief, grief, fury, disbelief. The case that had consumed the town for months, that had stripped the community of its sense of invincibility, had come to a close. But the aftershocks were only just beginning. The outcome didn't just mark the end of a murder trial. It marked the end of a world the town once thought it understood. Reputations were shattered, alliances were destroyed, and the identity of the entire community was forced into question. People had always taken pride in the country club, the manicured lawns, the polished stone driveways, and the families who seemed to embody success. It wasn't just wealth that held them together. It was image, status, and the belief that they lived above the kind of chaos that plagued the outside world. The conviction of one of their own broke that belief into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. The same person who had once stood beside them at fundraisers, whose name was etched onto plaques and trophies, was now branded a murderer. And with that branding came the undeniable truth that no one truly knew the people they had placed on pedestals. In the days that followed, once respected names became taboo in conversation. People deleted photos from social media, removed plaques, tore down smiling portraits that once hung proudly in the country club halls. Those closest to the convicted scrambled to distance themselves, giving interviews, issuing statements, insisting they had seen the signs but had chosen silence. The guilt didn't rest solely on the criminal. It infected everyone who had looked the other way, who had heard the whispers and brushed them off as gossip, who had put appearances before truth. The ripple effect extended far beyond social circles. Businesses owned by the convicted lost customers overnight. Charities they had supported returned donations, not wanting their causes tainted by association. Children of the accused, once popular and well-connected, faced whispers in school hallways and invitations that never came. The punishment for the crime reached into every corner of the accused's life, pulling apart the legacy they had spent years building. But the impact didn't stop there. It touched the lives of every resident who had believed their community was somehow different, somehow immune. As the community processed its grief and disbelief, uncomfortable conversations began to surface. How many people had known? How many had heard arguments, noticed strange behaviors, and said nothing? A new kind of silence took over, one not born of privilege or denial, but of shame. The town was forced to reflect on the culture it had built, one where truth was sacrificed for the sake of status, where image mattered more than character, and where secrets were buried as long as smiles stayed bright. The media attention didn't fade quickly. Journalists who had once reported from the courthouse steps now sought out deeper stories, the hidden financial scandals, the private betrayals, the layers of lies that had held the community together like glue. Residents found themselves caught between cooperation and self-preservation, unsure whether to speak or disappear from the spotlight entirely. For some, the trial was the start of a long overdue cleansing. For others, it was a wound that would never heal. The emotional cost was immeasurable. The victim's family, though granted justice by the court, faced a loss that no verdict could repair. Their grief became public, dissected and interpreted by strangers, and while some offered genuine support, others avoided them altogether, unsure of what to say or how to acknowledge that such pain had existed in a place meant for comfort and peace. The town's failure to protect one of its own became a stain no one could wash away. In the shadows of the now infamous country club, the once pristine landscape seemed duller. The laughter that once echoed across the pool, the polite nods at the tennis courts, the carefully curated brunches, all carried a weight they hadn't before. People no longer saw each other the same way. Every smile was evaluated, every friendship second-guessed. The case had stripped away the masks. What remained was raw, uncertain, and real. The story that unfolded within the gates of the country club served as a disturbing revelation, not just because of the crime itself, but because of where it happened and who was involved. In a world defined by luxury cars, designer wardrobes, and meticulously landscaped lawns, the idea of evil had always been abstract, something distant, confined to news reports about other towns, other people, other lives. But the murder destroyed that illusion. It forced everyone in that pristine community to confront the uncomfortable truth that darkness does not recognize income brackets or social status. It exists in every corner, even behind the most polished doors. For years, the country club had stood as a symbol of perfection. Its grand chandeliers, white tablecloth dinners, and tightly maintained exclusivity gave members a sense of superiority. The smiles exchanged at charity auctions, the handshakes on the golf course, the cocktails at sunset. They were part of a carefully preserved image. Everyone knew their role, and every interaction was a performance. No one expected real danger to seep into such a space because they believed they had insulated themselves from it. But the murder changed that in an instant. Suddenly, evil wasn't just a theoretical concept. It had a face. It had walked among them. It had eaten at their tables and toasted champagne alongside them. What was most jarring wasn't just the act itself, but how well it had been hidden. The killer had moved unnoticed, disguised by the very privilege and status that gave others a false sense of security. There was no monster in the shadows. There was no stranger lurking at the edge of the town. The danger had come from within. Wearing tailored clothes and speaking with polite charm, it was the person who knew the layout of the club, who understood when security would be lax, who had built a life on being trusted. And that realization unsettled everyone. People began to question not only who they trusted, but why they had trusted them in the first place. Was it because of their reputation? Their money? Their social influence? In hindsight, so many things seemed obvious. Strange behaviors, quiet tensions, unexplained absences. But in the moment, they had been ignored, dismissed, or worse, excused. That's the nature of well-maintained privilege. It allows people to be blind to flaws when the surface looks beautiful, but the murder revealed that underneath the polish were layers of fear, resentment, and desperation that had been growing for years. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that many in the community had chosen silence over discomfort. They had seen things, suspected things, and heard things that didn't feel right, but they didn't speak. Whether out of fear of social repercussions or a refusal to believe someone like them could do something so dark, they had allowed the facade to stand. The crime shattered not only their image of the accused, but also their image of themselves. How could they have let it happen? How could they have failed to see what now seemed so clear? This reckoning extended to every corner of the club. Events were canceled. Memberships were quietly suspended. Families who had lived there for decades moved away, unable to bear the weight of their neighbors' eyes. New rules were discussed. Security was tightened. But beneath all the procedural changes was something deeper. A shift in perception. The country club was no longer seen as a fortress of wealth and comfort. It was a reminder that no matter how high the hedges or how long the guest list, evil needs no invitation. It only needs a crack to slip through. Conversations among residents took a new tone. No longer was the talk centered on vacations or investment portfolios. Now it was about trust, fear, and truth. People questioned the values they had been upholding for so long, values rooted in image, not integrity. They began to examine their relationships more closely, to listen more intently, to notice what had once been ignored. Some even acknowledged that, for too long, they had prioritized silence over justice, politeness over honesty. The murder was a breaking point, a moment that revealed what had always been lurking beneath the surface. In a place built on prestige and power, it was a brutal reminder that evil does not come with warning signs or wear a mask. It walks quietly, dresses well, and knows exactly where to hide. And sometimes, the most dangerous place it can hide is behind the very face you trust the most. Is there any chance that this one is what decides this?